Welcome to the Game Maker's Notebook, a podcast featuring a series of in-depth one-on-one conversations between game makers providing a thoughtful, intimate perspective on the business and craft of interactive entertainment. The Game Maker's Notebook is presented by the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, a member-driven organization dedicated to the recognition and advancement of interactive entertainment.
Welcome to a very special edition of Game Maker's Notebook here at GDC. I'm Greg Rice from Double Fine Productions, and I'm here with Ian Dallas of Giant Sparrow to talk about probably mostly food, it sounds like, but also his amazing games, Unfinished Swan and Edith Finch, and mostly food.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's a lot of food in both of those games, so we could spend the hour if that's how you want to talk.
We did mostly get into a big conversation about Japanese food, and now probably that's mostly what we'll discuss. But no, I mean, first I should say congratulations on the big narrative win yesterday.
Oh, thank you.
Very well deserved. This game is an amazing game, and I know it was a long road. I had the pleasure of seeing it multiple times throughout development and seeing it come together, and I was blown away by where it went and how it ended up. And it was definitely one of the highlights of the year, and I'm super glad that it's been so successful.
Oh, thanks. No, I'm sure it must be a special treat to you to see it in, at times, catastrophic states that, on the operating table that we managed to save the patient.
Yeah. Well, I want to get into it, but I feel like I actually would love to go back a bit.
Sure.
Even before Unfinished Swan, I feel like there's a ton of stories there I want to dig into, but I don't know much about you before that. So I'd love to hear, where you came from, how you got into games, all that.
We only have the hour, but let me just, I'll try to encapsulate. I guess originally in third grade in 1987, got a copy of Super Mario Brothers from my grandmother and spent spent the next week just playing that straight.
I think that was my first game.
Yeah.
It was a lot of people's first game.
It's really burned into my memory. And then, some really seminal experiences like Tenchu and Thief and Ultima Underworld. And I felt like at some point, I would really love to get into games. Initially, in college, I thought that I would be a writer for video games. And my plan was to, after college, to write for movies and TV. And, that was kind of seemed like there was a career path there as a writer. And I thought that, well, if I give it enough time, eventually, people will need writers for video games. And then I can go do that because I really, had this strong interest in video games as a medium.
I find that really interesting that you say you felt like there was a career path, I guess, implying that there wasn't one in games at the time?
No, I mean, not really. If you want to write for movies, you can buy books about how to write for movies. That's the thing. And similarly, for television, for games, I guess maybe that exists now. But
more than it did then.
More than it did then. Even now, it's still a pretty rocky career path. But at the time I thought, well, okay, let's write for television or comedy or whatever. So I came out and initially was a writer at The Onion for 2 years or so. That was my first job out of college. And then I moved to Los Angeles and was, the lowest of the low peons on some television shows. My first job was driving scripts around Los Angeles at night to deliver them to people. And,
I've done that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's, in a way, kind of I treasure those moments of being, at the very bottom rung where you have no responsibilities and you can just kind of absorb it. And Los Angeles is kind of a magical place of all these crazy things going on. And San Francisco, where we are now, also a magical place in different ways. So I initially thought I would write for video games, and then realized that's never going to be the job that I hoped it would be, where I'd have a lot of creative input in it, in the way that writing for television, you really get to determine things. So I decided that what I really wanted to do was to make games in a more holistic sense of not just writing them, but creating them from the ground up. And so I taught myself a bit of programming. I had been interested in programming before that, just for these weird little hobby projects. I made a map of New York City that would calculate the shortest distance between 2 points without going past a Starbucks. And so I taught myself a little bit of programming that was necessary to, jigger that kind of thing up. And that, just sort of segued into eventually making these game prototypes.
Yeah. So
And
this would have been, I guess, maybe early 2000s.
yeah.
Yeah. So
This
what
is-
kind of tools were out there these days? What were you working with?
Oh, I mean, the Starbucks map was like PHP and Flash 3 or something, like super, super archaic. But yeah, I mean, it was weird in those days. Like, video games were still something that felt like they were all made in Japan. It wasn't something that Americans really like talked about as a development I mean, certainly there were no podcasts with game developers sharing, inside stories
Sure.
in those days. And yeah, so moving forward a little bit, I went to USC for grad school in
Right.
game design, and while I was there, I created a prototype for a game that ultimately became the Unfinished Swan.
Right. So that was, I think, shown for the first time at TGS.
Yeah, the Sense of Wonder Night.
Sure.
Like I think the first Sense of Wonder Night.
Yeah, and it seemed I don't know if that was the show, but it seemed to get like very quickly spread across the internet.
Yeah, it had a nice quality of being something people had never seen before, but that they could immediately understand in about a second of this, totally white world with a paintball splatting it, and the paint helping to reveal, what the geometry of the world looked like.
Yeah, it was very experimental at the time, right? There wasn't a lot of stuff that was pushing in such an extreme direction.
Yeah, I mean, it's still like a pretty weird thing. It's funny at GDC to walk around, and E3 is kind of similar. Like to look at all of the games that I've haven't seen before, and so many of them seem like oddly familiar. I mean, video games just as a medium is there's so much love for the past that in some ways like it's like history just keeps repeating itself with a number of games in ways that. Like for me, like it's not what I'm in. Like I'm interested in games that are giving me experiences I've never had before. But there is like a lot of games and players that are interested in like refinements on things. I mean, it's like we were talking about like Japanese cuisine earlier. Like it's that kind of school of something that it's okay that this restaurant has existed for 400 years. Like I will take the same egg, in the same way that it's been prepared. I like the way this is styled.
Yeah, I think there's so many games that are out these days, and as someone who I work on the publishing side of Double Fine, so someone who's seeing thousands of games every year, you always really want to see something that's striking and stands out and is unlike anything you've seen before and catches your eye. And I definitely remember seeing Unfinished Swan for the first time, and it's one, visually very striking because it's two tones, but then just that mechanic is such an interesting thing that's so immediately readable, and you can see how it can go to so many places.
Yeah, and we decided not to go there, which I think a lot of people were upset about.
I was so blindsided by that.
Yeah, no, we, in hindsight, did a terrible job of marketing that game. We were making a game about the unknown, and we thought that the most effective way to create that experience for people would be to tell them as little as possible about it, to hook them with the initial premise of splatting this white world, and then, to keep surprising them in ways. But, what we didn't realize is that we had set up this expectation in a lot of people's minds, particularly, in 2009 or whenever the trailer came out, people were expecting it to be something like Portal, where you had this one singular mechanic and then the game was just exploring that mechanic. And instead, what the game, evolved into was an exploration of that feeling of what does it feel like to be in a white world, to fumble your way through, and to slowly discover what is around you. And what we found in playtesting was that feeling is very delicate. It lasts for a couple of minutes as you're exploring the possibility of this mechanic in this world. But if you just keep those things static, and reveal slightly more complicated geometry or, moving things, whatever like that mechanic could have evolved into, it loses that sense of the unknown and that sense of wonder.
Yeah, I find it interesting for you to talk about it as a disappointment to so many people because to me that was such an exciting part of the game is that you like exactly like you said, the first time I saw the first demo, it does feel like there's such an exciting unknown possibility of what could be around the corner. So now for the game to just like totally twist that with every chapter, I found that like really engaging and it's kind of something that pulled me through the game really quickly.
Oh yeah, no, I'm glad to hear you liked it. And certainly there are a lot of people that do enjoy the game. I just remember, I guess at the time when it came out, there were a lot of people who felt disappointed, especially because it was a game that they'd been waiting for 4 years or whatever, to experience, that they had built up in their mind this sense of what that would be. And it was never our intent to make that game.
Sure.
And I feel like as a game developer, that's one of the things I learned about, that like you're not just making a trailer and then 4 years later, like delivering the final product. Like you're kind of creating this experience in people's minds for the whole development process and getting people excited about it and, sharing hopefully the sense of what it is that you're tending towards.
Cool. Well, I guess not only in the process of taking the game in that direction, but a million things were happening at the time, right? Like you signed a publishing deal, you were starting a new studio. There are so many new things to figure out with that game besides just making not only one game with one mechanic, but one game with like 8 mechanics.
Yeah, no, certainly, starting up an indie studio is not for the faint of heart, or the married. And luckily, I was neither of those things. And it's been a really fun 9 years or so.
Yeah, and so the Unfinished Swan with the Sony Santa Monica, right?
Mhm.
And you were actually embedded in their office for a while.
Yeah, we signed a deal with Sony shortly after I think Flower had shipped or was just about to ship, and they had this really great experience with that game company, who was another group of folks from USC, and so it felt like, oh, here's another game developer from USC. Let's basically sign literally the same contract, with the names changed, and part of that was this incubation phase where they would have us in their office and provide support, and it was really great to be able to be making this very experimental title, but to go to programmers on God of War, like giant Sony games, and be able to ask them questions when we needed to.
Yeah, I mean, those people have a really special thing going there. I mean, God of War series is amazing, and it's an artistic achievement in its own right. But then to have these such interesting, unique games coming from small studios within that studio was such a special moment in time.
Yeah, no, I think Sony was really accommodating in so many ways that I'm really thankful for. That there were just a lot of people, right up to Shuhei, who frankly is like one of the nicest, hardest working people I've ever met. And I think that kind of thing really trickles down. And there are a lot of people at Sony, like Yumi Yang, who's on the God of War team, who it was just like so kind and generous with us, helping us along. And I mean, we never would have made the game without their support.
Mm-hmm. So how many people were on the team in those days?
We started with 2, and then I think peaked at around maybe 12 for Unfinished Swan, 12, 13.
And it started with just you, right?
Well, I think from day one, it was me and this weird Frenchman who had helped out on the initial prototype. So it was like, I mean, it's me, but then this other guy who technically was doing an internship, I think, for immigration reasons. We classified him as an intern for the year that he was there.
Yeah. Well, how did you find that process of bringing other people in the fold and collaborating with people to like grow this thing into something larger?
I mean, it was one of the more difficult parts of that process for sure. As someone who had been, kind of working on their own projects, like when I was working in television or like writing scripts for that, it was always just me by myself, basically writing these things, and to work with a group of people is a whole new set of challenges. And like I ended up reading a lot of books about like communication and listening skills, and it didn't occur to me when I started making games that was going to become like one of the most important parts of the process, was becoming a better human being in that sense of understanding people a bit better. And yeah, I mean, it's very humbling to fail so much at that, and to have people be so frustrated in ways that now I look back on it and it's like clearly could have been avoided. But I was focused on making the game, and yeah, it was.
Now, as somebody who was an ex-producer on narrative games with many mechanics, how did the team react to the fact that this game was, not just what the prototype was, but was so many new ideas and so many mechanics?
Yeah, it's hard for me to remember that far back what the reaction was, but I do remember that Sony was. There was a mixture of concern, but also grudging respect, I suppose, because the process was not only that we would, I mean, we thought we would make this kind of much simpler thing, but it turned into something a bit more complicated. But, I think because when it was transforming into these other, weird mechanics and things, like people could actually see why it was taking shape, and it felt like the things that we were discovering, like this vine growing thing or whatever, were actually like really exciting. And at the time, Sony was, I'm sure that they had meetings that we were not a part of, where there were some harsh words and perhaps some tears about like, why is this game, now twice as long in development or whatever. But, because it looked very promising, I think that bought us a lot of goodwill on everybody's part. So, even though it wasn't what we had initially kind of expected to make, it had turned into something that people were pretty excited about.
Well, it seems like it worked out because the next step was making a game with even more mechanics.
Yes. No, having succeeded barely the first time, we decided to kind of double our money and go all in on the next one and make a game that is about a dozen totally different mechanics that are constantly changing.
Yeah, so it's the game that a producer would say to never make, but
Yes.
you made it.
Yes. No, and I don't think we probably would have made the game if we had known, what it was going to be at the outset. But that's, one of the beautiful things that you only get to really know about it at the end after it's all, shipped.
Sure. Well, why don't you give us your quick description of Finch from like a narrative perspective and a mechanical perspective.
Sure.
And there's probably some prepared speech in here that you would give
Yes.
on a normal podcast.
For
in a
the
few
last
minutes.
couple of years, one of my roles in life has been to try to describe this indescribable experience. But the best description I've come up with is that Edith Finch is a collection of short stories about a cursed family in Washington State. And you play as Edith Finch coming back to the house that you grew up in, trying to figure out why she is the last of her family left alive. And in each of the bedrooms in this house, you find a different story that is about how that family member died. And you get to live out their kind of final moments.
That would seem very polished. You've given this before, I could tell.
Yeah, this is not the first time I've been asked about that, but I like to feel like, it's slightly different every time.
Nice.
But
well, I'd love to get into some specific levels and talk a little bit about how they all came together. I feel like, an interesting first one we'd talk about would be Milton, just to kind of bridge the gap between the stories.
Yeah, Milton is the one of the last stories that you find in the house, but one of the first that kind of came together conceptually for us. He's related to our previous game, The Unfinished Swan. He's the king character in that. He's much older, and yeah, it was a really odd kind of thing to have this idea that lasted so long, but by the time we got around to actually making it, there's a lot of concern that it would feel too goofy to have this reference to an earlier game, that was not as serious, in its treatment of human mortality and other issues. And yeah, it's been really nice that so far most people who've played the game feel like, it fits well and is this, kind of touching moment for them, because it could have gone a different way. But like so many things in the process of making this game, we just kind of got lucky and it all sort of fit together somehow.
Sure. Yeah, and I found it an interesting level because obviously Finch is a very narrative focused game. It's kind of all about the story in many ways, and I think it's a good reminder that Unfinished Swan led with mechanics, and it was kind of how people came to the game, but it was a narrative game as well. And I like that this bridge did kind of bring these two games together and made you think about the ways that they were similar as well.
Yeah, and for me, it's odd to hear the game being described as a narrative game. It never occurred to me that, until people started describing them that way, that they were, games with a prominent narrative. For me, it's always like a step before that of what is the tone and what is the feeling. And both of the games, for me, are like very much about the sense of wonder. And in Unfinished Swan, it's a little bit more of this kind of childlike sense of this unexplored world. And in Edith Finch, it's a slightly more somber sense of awe of being in this place of the unknown that is simultaneously beautiful but also a little bit overwhelming. And yeah, it just turned out that like the best way that we could describe that to people was heavily indebted to a lot of literature, particularly things like 100 Years of Solitude and a bit of H.P. Lovecraft and Neil Gaiman, and so it has this kind of literary patina that does make it feel a little bit more narratively driven, But that wasn't really our intent at all. It just sort of happened, to work out that way because of, all of the references that we were absorbing.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's funny to hear you again say that you didn't think of it as a narrative game, and I think it is kind of a bit of a dirty word. Narrative in games is, I think, something every can kind of agree with is not typically the greatest part of the game.
Yeah.
We often get it wrong. There's more and more games now that are getting it right, and I think there's also more and more games that are pushing it in interesting directions. Finch obviously being a nice standout of that. I'd love to hear other games that you've kind of pointed to that you think have done narrative well, or done it in an interesting way that you kind of drew from.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of games, there's not a lot that we drew from explicitly. Certainly in terms of narrative and tone. Like functionally, there was a lot that we looked to for other games for advice on how to do things like even just reticles or whatever. But yeah, I mean, in terms of games that I think are expressive in successful ways, I guess the Eco and Shadow of the Colossus for me would be the kind of high watermarks. And I think for me, those games are so wonderful because they communicate through motion. That in Eco, it's not, I mean, it is a wordless story, which is kind of annoying because I think games have gotten into this bad habit of seeing wordless stories as being this kind of pinnacle of storytelling. But really, like, it's about the connection, that you see of these two characters holding hands and the fact that they are so different. That there's this small boy who moves in a, kind of, energetic, athletic fashion. And then, this wispy older girl who moves quite differently. And that relationship, I think is just very touching and doesn't require words in that case. And Shadow of the Colossus similarly, that it's a game that is, I feel like, would only be designed by an animator. You've got these giant characters who have the benefit of moving very slowly. That when you have something that is enormous, it's just because of physics, is going to move slower. So you get this real sense of the grace and majesty and character of these creatures that is hard to get if they were regular size. They would just be moving too fast to really appreciate that.
Yeah, those games are masterful. I mean, the way they get you to connect with a character and feel emotion for them with very little dialogue, the way they make you feel like the world has been there and things have happened in it is beyond many games I'd ever seen at that time. And I always look forward to their stuff. Well, I'd love to talk about a few other levels as well. So I think the very first level I ever saw, like I said, it would have been 3 or 4 years maybe before the game came out. It would have been Molly's level.
Mm-hmm. Probably in the original Unity prototype.
Yeah, most
version.
likely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it looked a lot different than it does now. But everything was mostly there. As far as the ideas behind it, the kind of main story beats and the mechanics. And I think that was the level that right away made me think, oh my God, how are they going to get this made? Because of all the levels, it has at least 4 or 5 mechanics in just that one level.
Yeah, that's an absurd story to start with. And it's even more embarrassing to admit that Lewis's story was the next one we did, which is, also just like this collection of all these different levels in one. And, they're kind of, it ended up being a good introduction, I think, for players to have a story that is not just about one mechanic, but is about, several of these different, you're becoming these different animals, and the owl controls very differently from the shark, from the tentacle monster, etc. And yeah, it was a game that could never have been made if that was every single story, at that complexity. And it's nice that our game has, 2 stories that are that complicated. And we kind of learned after making those that, yeah, there's no way that we could ship that. So we kind of pared down future stories to have a similar feeling, but not a similar length.
Yeah, I was curious about that because I was wondering if that was the intent, that they would be coming that quickly throughout the entire game. And I kind of expected that.
Yeah, we did too initially. And then it just, reality hit us in the face.
Sure.
And it's hard when you're like, oh, I really love this thing, but we can't do it. But luckily with a game about short stories, we could say, well, we do have room in our heart for 1 or 2 of you.
Yeah, well, like for the second time, just like the first game, I saw a little bit of it. I kind of expected that, and I was pleased that it went into a different direction, and that the chapters were so distinct from each other, and that they weren't all just like a million mechanics at once, and some of them, did stick to something, and maybe even stick to something very specific. So I think one of the other ones I hear from a lot of people as being a favorite is Calvin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which again is a very simple chapter, but I
Yeah.
think it really resonated with people emotionally.
Yeah, and I think that for me is probably my favorite story because I can't imagine it existing in any other game. To have Calvin's story takes place entirely on a swing set and is over, depending on the player, like probably in about 2 or 3 minutes. But we spent 3 years tuning those controls and mostly doing it badly. I mean, it's amazing that even after 2 years of that, we still had all these persistent problems with players. They would move one leg. In that story, your right stick controls your right leg and your left stick controls your left leg to swing, and people would control the one leg. But some people, like 25% of players, or whatever, would just get fixated on the one leg and they would never try the other leg.
Of
And
course.
we saw people in playtests like spend 5 minutes, with that. And even at the very end, we were still tuning that to like, how do we make this easier for players and how do we tune the physics? And it's like something that seems so simple to a player. When you play that game, you would say like, how could someone spend 3 years, noodling on this
Sure.
thing?
So
And yet we
that
did.
you just touched on like the most frustrating thing about making narrative games, which is that it's essentially years of watching broken things and people not understanding them.
Yeah, and it makes it very hard if you've got an emotional bar that you're trying to hit to determine how things are really going because there's so much noise that you see in these playtests of people just getting confused and frustrated. And I mean, luckily, you can test with people like yourself. That's why we bring in game developers because they're really good at playing games usually, and they can overlook a lot of those flaws.
Sure.
But the goal is like after 4 years of development that the experience that Greg Rice, might have playing a game would be similar to what like a regular human would experience.
Yeah, the playtesting process is always really interesting to see because you do kind of like to start with people who kind of know what they might be doing and have a sense of how video games work. But ultimately, your game's going to be played by a very wide audience, and it might be someone who doesn't have any idea what they're doing. And so it's interesting to try to figure out how to toe that line of like adjusting for the more casual player, but not over adjusting for somebody who wants to feel like there's they have some engagement with the game.
Yeah, no, it's a really difficult line, even in a game, like Edith Finch, where there aren't a lot of overt challenges. We struggled a lot with how obvious should we make the direction that players were expected to go in the game. Like initially we thought that in each bedroom, you would have essentially a puzzle of trying to locate where the story was in that bedroom. And, maybe even like an overt, I don't know, like a series of clockwork, gears and things that turn, or even just, looking under the bed to kind of force players to explore that space. And what we found is that just really didn't feel like this game. Like it was enough for us to put the object in a very conspicuous place, but to make the world hopefully interesting enough that players would be encouraged rather than forced to spend time, looking through these bedrooms and trying to figure out what kind of a person, might have lived and died here.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like how successful was that? Do you feel like people bypass content? Do you feel like could you avoid a lot of levels, and did people?
Yeah, I think we found ultimately a pretty good balance. In fact, we did such a good job that we ran into problems with it very late in development because in the beginning, like the first couple bedrooms, we had we'd watched so many people play them that we had done a lot of tuning of like, move this book 2 centimeters or whatever to subconsciously guide players exactly where we wanted them to go without too much overt handholding. And we hadn't really done that same level of, craftsmanship on the later bedrooms, and people ran into players like had tons of issues in those bedrooms because they've been trained to expect that they would just sort of magically find the way through. And yeah, it's an amazing process to see how a game evolves over, years of playtesting and dozens of people going through it into something that you just waltz through. And it's just, people like naturally gravitate to wherever you want them to go, but only because you've had so many failures along the way that have
Sure.
shown you that like, no, that has to
And
be
it's tiny
moved.
things, right? That like they might not even realize are happening. Things that are just drawing their eyes in the right direction.
Yeah, no, it's just like a little like blades of grass that are waving that call your attention to something that, and it's not even one cue usually. It's 5 or 6 different cues that are all pointing the same way, and one of those hopefully will work for each player at least.
Sure. Well, before we leave Calvin, I am curious. How many people told you after playing that level that they used to think about that when they were a child?
Quite a few, actually. That was something that came up in playtests, and people would say it very confessionally as like, I've never told another soul this, but as a child, I used to imagine. So that was very gratifying. So it's like, oh, great, I'm not the only one.
Yeah,
That
I'm
had
curious because I
those.
feel like I definitely did. I'm wondering if just everybody does that and just doesn't talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the game developer secrets here is that it is impossible to go all the way loop to loop with a rope. There's something I don't quite understand the physics involved, but you would need some kind of stiff, support. So you can find YouTube videos of people going all the way around, but only on swings that have like stiff metal poles.
Oh,
So we
man.
took some liberties.
I don't know. This game is
here.
so unrealistic. I
Yeah.
can't believe that you would do something like this. Well, this entire game is about people dying. You made a game about people dying left and right, and some of them in very like gruesome and challenging ways. I'm sure it really touched a lot of people. I'm sure it really affected a lot of people, and some probably more than others. I'm specifically curious about Gregory and how people reacted to that.
Yeah, so Gregory's story is an infant in a bathtub, and we found that story was quite surprising in a couple of ways. One, we found with playtests very different results for players who had children versus those who did not. And for those of us on the development team, I think at the time, like none of us had children, and it was a little surprising, when we started hearing this feedback that apparently one of the things that happens is when you have a child, like you just react quite differently to infants in peril. And so that was something that we tried to be very sensitive to. And periodically with that story, we would bring in playtesters, specifically, parents, to gauge their reaction to it. The other thing that was interesting with that story is that the reactions people had were very different if they sat down and started with that story versus having them play through from the very beginning of the game, because that story occurs about halfway through the game, where they've already seen 3 or 4 other stories that are all about someone dying, and they have the sense of like each of these stories by that point is like going to end with the death. And so when you begin a story as a baby in a bathtub knowing that you will die, that hit people a lot harder. And
You wouldn't want to put that one first.
right. Now that was never in the cards.
Sure.
But that story ended up, in some ways being one of the easier to write, though, because we were dealing with such a weighty, loaded context that we didn't need to write very much for it. That it was something that we just kind of needed to stay out of our own way and let things, kind of inevitably go where they were going to go. But, in some ways, like just swim as hard as we could against that whirlpool and make it, as light and joyful as we could, because the story is also about, being a frog in this bathtub and, Waltz of the Flowers is playing, and there's this kind of balletic quality to it.
Yeah, and I feel like maybe the first time I played it, it didn't have that music.
It did not. No, that music came in quite late. We had 4 different gameplay programmers who cycled through and tried to, make that story work. And it's a difficult construct in a lot of ways. Like even just like at a functional level of doing platforming in a space where the camera is locked means that depth perception is very difficult to judge, and a lot of that kind of required knowing where the lip of the tub was. And so we were very focused on those issues. And, to his great credit, our final gameplay programmer, Evan Rogers, threw in this temp music that has a lot of, this kind of ballet quality to it that immediately solved a lot of our gameplay problems, because the tone suddenly felt, much lighter and freer.
Fix it with audio.
Yeah, no, it was really amazing that, it's really speaks to the quality of the team too, that we had, a gameplay programmer who knew just the right music to throw in.
Well, I don't want to spoil all of the levels. I feel like I'm going through it, but there are 2 more I feel like I have to definitely call out. One is just the next one I feel like is for emotional impact. I just found the pacing on this one so interesting, and the final payoff was such a surprise. And this was Sam's story. I'm curious because I don't think I ever saw that one, and I feel like it maybe never made its way into the playtests.
Yeah.
And was there just something about that one that was easier to pull off because it was so effective?
Yeah, I mean that story was mechanically one of our more simple, I guess, experiences where you're, taking a series of photographs and, sometimes you have limited control over the scene, but mostly it's, about kind of moving the camera around. And in some ways, like, it was just a lot easier to be in control of so much more. Like we could control the pacing in ways that were impossible for particularly the first person, control schemes of other stories, and just had this very like relaxed feel to it. So even like musically, it was much easier to score because you could trust that players would be at certain points along the way.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, that kind of leaves us with my last one, which was I feel like definitely my favorite. I feel like more people I've talked to have said this one is a favorite than any. But Lewis's,
Hmm.
you touched on early, I felt like was doing such interesting things with storytelling in the way that it combined his cannery life with his mental world, and ultimately it was very very powerful. And I'm curious to hear how that one came together. I didn't realize it was so early in development.
Yeah, I mean that one is the only story we had that was based very closely on an existing short story. Also, there's a short story from 1910 by Lord Dunsany called "The Coronation of Thomas Shapp," about a gentleman in London who imagines himself in this alternate world. And there's a lot that we invented, like the whole cannery and the fish chopping, and all of that is different, but the core premise of someone who is kind of imagining this world that becomes more and more compelling to them was there from the very beginning, and it really set the tone for the whole rest of the game too, because once we had found that for that one story, we realized that it actually felt like a lot of the other prototypes that we were kind of tinkering with, of this concept of being lost in a world of your own imagination, uh, was very similar to the way that it feels to play most video games. So that became, kind of a core theme that carried through a lot of stories.
Yeah. I'm curious, was there any it sounds like that there was an inspiration with this book, but the the fact that this has this kind of repetitive quality to it, and this kind of slow descent into deeper and deeper into this world feels very relatable to video game development. I'm curious if you know people who have had similar experiences to this, or anything, or is this purely just you struck gold with a magic idea out of
uh,
nowhere?
no, I mean, for me, the experience, like the monotony of chopping fish, was kind of loosely based on a summer I spent checking signatures for an initiative in Washington State. I grew up in Olympia, which is the capital of Washington, and I guess when there are initiatives that are going to go on the ballot to be voted on, if they're close in the terms of the number that they need to get onto the ballot, then they'll check them manually in those days. And it was my job for 8 hours a day to look through these pages and pages of initiative signatures and look for people's last names between MCCA and MC something E or whatever it was. This like tiny block of last names, and then find in the card catalog their DMV signatures and check to see if they matched. And it was a job that paid money.
Yeah,
But it was
sometimes you need one of those.
yeah, I mean, it was a great, actually, like, really, that's one of the reasons probably that I'm a game developer now, honestly, is that I had such a monotonous experience that I was like, never again. Let me never work in a job that is that soul crushing. And it was fine because I knew that this is not going to go on forever. I need to go back to school, and this initiative, would go or not. But yeah, that kind of working in a place where you desperately do not want to be, was kind of became the fish chopping.
Hmm. Well, I want to get back to this concept that you've built this studio. It's almost 10 years now, right?
Yeah,
It's been nine
9.
since you
Yeah,
first opened the studio, and you went from one person, two people making a game to now how many at this point?
1.
Back to one.
Mhm.
Well, how did we get there?
Yeah, so the games that we make are, these very uncertain prospects, where we don't really know going into them what they're going to be, and we figure it out as we go along. And um, something like for the next game, I have a lot of ideas for what I would like that game to be, but it's not at a state where, we can accommodate 15 people, showing up every morning at, 9 a.m. or whatever and making 3D models and textures and all that. And so the team, is kind of scattered for a little while. And the hope is that, once things coalesce a little bit, we will come back together, and some of us at least will continue on. And that was something that we were clear about early on when we were bringing people on for Finch, that this is something that we're all coming together. I mean, I think of the company much more like a band, where we're putting people together for this particular project, and hopefully we'll get a chance to work together again. But this is not like a lifetime that we're going to spend together. This is we have this moonshot, or this like dream project that we want to put together, and I think it really worked out well for Edith Finch and for Unfinished Swan, because we could bring on people who really fit the needs of that project.
It's a very coming from LA, it's a very Hollywood kind of approach to video game development.
Yeah, I mean, it is similar to the way that a movie will bring people on, but you're not gonna like keep a whole studio full of people in the downtimes. Although for our games, they take 4 to 5 years to make historically, so it's kind of a mixture of that, where people are there, and definitely like we feel like we're at a company, and we're there's a 401k, whatever. It's a thing. It's not like this fly by night operation, but it's also like, I mean, it takes so much to make these games that there's no way we can just turn on a dime once this game is shipped and be able to make this other completely different random new thing. Like, I just don't have that much juice in me. Like, I need time to kind of recuperate. And I feel like that's one of the reasons why we see so many games that are quite traditional and similar to previous games, that there just isn't that kind of breathing space to recharge and to come up with something radically different, and to fail on your own a while before you bring in a team.
I feel like with most jobs, and especially games, the kind of machinery is the thing you don't really think about when you're trying to get into the space. Like, you are coming into this creative field, you have like ideas of games you want to be making, and in your case probably have a bunch of prototypes of things that you want to be making. And then when you get to the point where now there's a team around you, and there's 10 people counting on you and depending on you, I can imagine there's a lot of pressure. I know it's a lot of pressure. And so I'd love to hear about your very public kind of process of losing a publisher midway through a project, and how that all went down.
I don't know how much I can really talk about it, other than to say that I am, super grateful to Sony and to Annapurna for being so accommodating, in that transition. And, I think Sony was, just like super, super generous, and really creatively gave us so much freedom throughout. And at some point, they just felt like this was a game that, was not a great fit for them, that their priorities had shifted. And Annapurna at the time, was just starting up a game division. And in fact, like a lot of people that used to be at Sony Santa Monica moved over to Annapurna. So for us, it felt like such a very natural transition, because we were still working with a lot of the same people. Like, they had already moved over. So we just, kind of essentially followed them where they were.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a very challenging kind of deal to make and change to make. And it sounds like there's really special people on both sides of the fence that made that a smooth process, and all really cared about the game. And that's
I mean, like all the way up and down the chain. I mean, certainly like Shannon Studstill, the director of Sony Santa Monica, and Shuhei, director of Worldwide Studios, were just really, really accommodating.
I think everybody knew this game had to come out. And it did, and it's great. And what'd you feel about the reactions of seeing people play this on day one, and what folks took out of the game?
I think for me, a lot of it was just relief that after so long, the game had actually come out, and that it was not terrible. Beyond that, I had zero expectations. I just wanted people who worked on the game to feel like they had contributed to something meaningful. As a creative director, that is like my nightmare fuel, that, I will have asked all these people to fight, this long, bloody, pointless war. That, if we can make something, if we can be successful at the end of the day, that transmutes all of, this struggle into something that, people feel is worthwhile. And I think we definitely achieved that with Edith Finch, like made something that, for a lot, like a number of people, is a game that is very important to them. And for me, like when I am making a game, like my goal is really just to make something that is so different from anything else that people have played, that for a small number of people, this will be like, one of their favorite games of all time. And it's been really gratifying to hear people say exactly that. Not like a lot of people, like there's a small group though that feels like, wow, Edith Finch really speaks to me. And it's great also with Twitter being such a more public place for that. Like I think 10 years ago, people might have, had really great things to say, or terrible things, whatever, about a video game, but you'd have to be like within earshot to hear that.
Or like know the right forum. But
yeah.
It's a very weird place to launch a game these days with, well, not only that kind of stuff, but immediately watching people play the game as soon as you hit go.
Yeah, I was not expecting so many Let's Plays to spring up for a game like Edith Finch. I guess it didn't occur to me that be something that people would want to watch all the way through. And that, I've heard people say that they've watched, half a dozen playthroughs of Edith Finch, like different people playing through. It just never really occurred to me that people treat the game almost like a movie that they're watching, which is mind-boggling because we spent so much time making it not a movie. But it's nice that the game, has a richness to it because it's dealing with real subjects, right? I mean, it's dealing with mortality, something that is close to everyone. And so it's an experience that people can enjoy in ways that we didn't necessarily intend, but, people kind of make it their own.
Yeah, and this obviously just gets to a wider audience. More and more people are watching this game that might have been playing it. And it's just interesting to think about this in designing your games, that people will be watching as well as playing. Do you find yourself in those streams? Are you watching? Are you lurking in comments?
A little bit. I think I've watched about as much as I can take by the time the game comes out. I mean, I've seen over 100 people play through the game and scrutinized it, like watched their faces and talked to them afterwards, and been very attentive to that. And so I mean, for me, in a way, like the game is sort of a dead thing. It's strange to be talking about it. I mean, it's wonderful talking to you, Greg, as always. But creatively, I've definitely moved on to thinking about this new can of worms that I've opened with this next project. So I mean, it's wonderful to hear that people have found so much in the game that speaks to them. But part of me feels like I'm just another fan at this point. Like I kind of have memories of what it was like working on the game, but I don't feel like I'm that same person anymore. I'm already like, kind of thinking about
Yeah, especially for a project so long, it was hard to like let something go. And then like once, I guess there's this thing that people who aren't making games might not realize, but there's like a period there where you're not touching it, right? Where it hasn't come out, where press is playing it and where it's going through certification. So there's this like adjustment period in your life where you're learning not to be working on that game.
And there's a part where even before you are actively hands off, even like the last 6 months, where you're not really changing much, hopefully, about the game. Like you are in this kind of bug fixing and polishing phase, but you switch over from being really like emotionally tied up with it in this kind of productive way into just being like more of a caretaker. It's kind of like raising like a small child versus, I don't know, like a teenager or something, where you're just sort of like corralling it a little bit, but you're already kind of changing your relationship.
And then it feels like it's out the door and nobody knows about it yet. And you have this like brief moment of calm, and then suddenly you've put it to bed and you've moved on, and then suddenly now everyone's playing and you're hearing the whole world talk about your game.
That's the best case scenario.
Sure. And you're suddenly seeing every possible reaction to it. How do you deal with that sort of feedback?
I mean, I try not to think about it too often because, I could spend, and this isn't like a comment about our game, this is really just a comment about the world we live in, but, I could spend several hours a day following people talking about Edith Finch and posting Let's Plays on YouTube if I really wanted to. And, it sort of reminds me of this Wim Wenders film, I think at the End of the World, maybe, where people can watch their own dreams and everyone just gets like so absorbed in the same that they like stop doing anything else. So I kind of have to force myself not to navel gaze at like, oh, what is this? What are people talking about? Because I feel like now it's a lot of kind of similar commentary, like having spent many hours poring over like what people are saying about the game, that it's wonderful that it still is finding such an audience though.
Yeah, I feel like there's a period where it's like practical because there's like potential bugs or issues and things you might be able to address with the game still from the community. And then I feel like there's like the wanting to find someone who really got it and put it into words in a way that maybe even you couldn't. And that's always a nice moment. And then I do feel like then there's a process of like stepping away from it. And I'd be curious to hear about how that went for you for this game and what you've been doing since you were ultimately able to like fully put it aside.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I've fully put it aside because here I am.
Yeah, you've got awards to win, of course.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. No, we got the BAFTAs coming up.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I look at the BAFTAs as that's the final, nail in the coffin for Edith Finch. Hopefully, after that, I can really focus on this new thing. But no, for me personally, after we shipped the game in April, but then we didn't ship the Xbox version until like July or sometime in then. So this is a bit more time. And then after that, I went overseas for about 6 months and was traveling around, mostly focused on food, going to countries whose food I enjoyed but didn't really know very much about and wanted to explore kind of firsthand, and spent a lot of time doing that. And then simultaneously was starting to teach myself animation, and was working through a bunch of tutorials for how to do basic animation. And a few weeks ago I started an animation class, so that's for the next year or so. My plan is to become a better animator, because our next project is very focused on animation, and it's something that I'm really interested in personally, but then as a creative director I really want to develop an eye for like what makes motion interesting and beautiful, and be able to work with hopefully soon like a team of talented animation programmers and animators working on this crazy new project.
It sounds like there's been some adventures at least too. You said you'd been to Japan recently.
Yeah, that was part of this trip. That was like I kind of went started in Europe, and then went to places that were a little bit more off the grid, and then ended up in Japan, which is for me like much more familiar territory. There are public bathrooms and streetlights, and
Sure.
it feels like regular civilization. So yeah, the last leg was spending about a month or so in Japan, working my way through a lot of ramen shops.
Well, that's the way to do it. Now we're talking. Well, I'm very excited to see what you get up to. I'm glad you're back at it, and it sounds like taking on something even more crazy.
Yeah, no, each game, we ratcheted it up a bit, but, all I can promise at this point is that it is going to be completely unlike anything we have ever made before, but, it will probably, by the time it comes out, feel somewhat similar to those games. I think I'm still interested in this sense of wonder and, trying to find that in a video game form.
I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for joining us. This has
Oh,
been
my
amazing.
pleasure.
This has been wonderful, and thanks for listening, folks who are listening. I swear Ted Price will be back soon. You will have your fearless leader back in action, but thanks for joining us this go around. Anything else? Oh, yeah, we want to plug ourselves?
Oh.
You should plug yourself, Ian, of course.
Sure. Yeah. You can find Giant Sparrow on Twitter at Giant Sparrow, and our website is giantsparrow.com.
Awesome. And I'm Greg Rice from Double Fine. We're at Double Fine, and we're making lots of crazy games. Go play them soon.
Thank you for joining us for the Game Maker's Notebook. For more information on the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, our podcasts, and our other initiatives, please visit www.interactive.org.